Well, I think Emily and I are both so thrilled to be here and celebrating this absolutely incredible and really exciting new translation. And I think you said that you might be willing to kick us off with a little reading. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I I'm going to read something dark, which is apparently all I do since I don't know. I thought translating Beowulf was going to be this like exuberant joke fest, and there are funny parts of Beowulf, but Beowulf is also full of blood and guts and misery. So I'm going to read you some blood and guts and misery. I'm going to read you the Grendel and Beowulf battle, which is, it's always interesting. It's shorter than you would think all of the battles. I see a couple of people saying they can't hear anything. I hope that's not true. Screen freeze. Okay, maybe people just having glitches. Okay, here we go. Hidden by fog, Grendel roved the moors, God-cursed, grudge worsening. He knew who he hunted. Wine drunk, mead met men, and he pined for his prey. Under storm clouds he stalked them in his usual anguish, feeling a forbidden hearth, that gilded hall atop the hill gleaming still through years of bloodshed. This was not the first time he'd hunted in Hrothgar's hall, but never before nor later had he such hard luck. No one worthy had historically lain in wait. The warrior worked his way toward the war, his head and heart hurting, and arrived at the iron-crossed door. Its hinges howled a welcome, his rage ratcheted up. He flung the hatch wide and leapt into the mead room, over decorated floors, into the hold, fury frothing. His heart crowed as he counted them. Man by man, nested together, roosting like roasting chickens. He'd be the sort of fox that stalks the night. Eat his fill, no coup remaining, no bill, only feathers, loose on the floor. Before sunrise, he planned to prize souls from skeletons. His weird though would no longer be writ in others' blood, red footprints to the door and out the moors, the mere no. Tonight was the night Grendel's goose would be cooked, his funeral banquet bruised and blue. Fervid and flexing, faking sleep, Hygelac servant spied from his bench, scanning slit-eyed the long-haunted hall, awaiting the hunted hunter. At last his enemy struck, snatching a sleeper, sucking him bone dry, staining the pale planks red, grunting, gobbling, gnawing him limb from limb, here a throat, here a head, fingers, feet, dead. Hands outstretched to slaughter a second, Grendel dropped his first course, spotting the bed where Beowulf slept. He gripped that sleeper, though, and found himself conscripted, his own hand grabbed by a commanding get. The grasp began the tear that would take Grendel out, rendering him a revenant in the hall he'd always reveled in. His bones cracked, but he could not wrestle free from the clasp, war-wedded to a woe-bringer, who clung like no human ever clung, keeping him close. Grendel was an unwilling draftee, never bested before nor held hostage. Now Hygelac's man, chanting the boasts he'd made his bed ride, climbed from the covers to get a better grip. Knuckles buckled, joints unjoined. The attacker became the attacked, racked with pain, attempting to escape, to race from hall to fens, his hidden highways. His own grasp unlatched, his flesh locks loosened, try though he might to divest himself of Furet and return home, dive into the dark and abide with any awful thing there, stay in stealthy health the rest of his days. The room shook. Benches splintered and Danes dreamt of doom or quivered, questioning. The warriors wrestled, muscles bulging and raged, screaming for their lives. The hall trembled but stayed standing, its design fit for fighting. The wooden walls crossed with iron bands, a forest fettered together, though from what I've heard, the mead benches stood on end and shattered, gold sigils no match for battle. The two fighters fought on in the rubble. I mean, damn, man, until this night, no shielding would have believed the hall could be felled by anything but flame, its ivory and iron, its careful cantilevers. Tonight, though, it risked timbering. A wailing clamor rose again, echoing over the confines, and the North Danes listened to the sound of doom's hammer, instability building a home in the hearts of those who heard it. The whole hill quaked with the shriek of that almighty abrogate, the loner's lament, handcuffed by hopelessness, losing to an unforeseen leader. The warrior holding him was stronger than any monster, more muscular than any man. That stalwartest of soldiers had no wish to imprison the invader, only to slay him. Grendel's life wasn't worth living, and Beowulf had decided to end it. His own men stood too as the unarmed enemies swung heirloom blades willy-nilly, though really their captain needed no safekeeping. They swung for the slayer's soul, but their struggle was for naught. They could have stayed sleeping rather than fought, or merely watched the battle, for their swords, sharp as they were, couldn't injure the fiend. His spells warded him, annealing his skin. Still, his death would be agony. The world clung to his fingers, and life leaving wouldn't be swift, no existence snuffing instantaneous gift, but sickly slow suffering, his sinning spirit sent to sink slowly down to hell. He knew it now. He who'd spent seasons haunting this hall, preying on poets, bringing pain to the privileged, infuriating the Almighty. His body was breached, its bones were breaking. Higelac's kinsmen had him in hand, each of them living, canceled out the other, as Cain had Abel, brother unbrothered. Grendel's shoulders split, tendons twisting, arteries unscrolled, his limb worried from him, bested by fatal fists. Beowulf the winner, Grendel dismissed. He ran then for his grave, still living. He rushed to the water, wound weeping, lair his last longing. His hourglass was emptying now, his days done, and he knew it. Each heartbeat wrote its number in red, and the ringdanes were delivered of their wretch with a ring. This enemy was dead. Grendel.
I don't want to clap for the death of Grendel, but I want to clap for you because that sounds so good, but out loud. I guess I want to know about how you got to the language, how you got to that voice. Because, of course, the original has this poetics that depends on alliteration, but it seems like you're doing so much more than just alliterate. You're both alliterating so much with so much energy, but you also have this rhythmicality and also all these half rhymes and rhymes. And I guess I'm curious about you're throwing all this poetics at us, and it's you might think it would be too much, but it's not. It's just the right amount of too much. It's great. How did you know to do that? I mean, did you always know? Did you go through many drafts and then figure it out? And this needs more. Or how did you do that?
I mean, I did do a lot of drafts of this because I was trying to make it flow. Because the thing that was important to me as I was working on this project was getting the story to come through. You know, I feel like in a lot of older translations, the story is kind of hard to follow. You're like, what is actually happening? Because the poet also digresses, as you even heard in that section. He stops and he describes the hall for a while in the middle of the battle. He's like, let me just tell you about how pretty it was, like such a nice hall. So I the voice that I chose for the poem, and it's a different voice kind of throughout the poem, but the voice that I chose was this kind of storyteller voice. And in my experience of storytelling and my experience of theater, which is I started as a playwright and a poet at the beginning of my career before I started writing novels and writing kind of everything. The things that you remember are the things that have the rhyme and that have alliteration that are like a call out. So I thought, okay, write it in a way where the story especially rhymes and has alliteration and has half rhyme throughout that jumps from line to line, which is something that people don't usually do with this material. Usually there's the dread end rhyme, which I did occasionally. I did do that. I thought sometimes it was fun to do that, but mostly the rhymes are like leaping through the centers of lines, and that was to make it all move, really, to make it keep moving from section to section without getting us stuck on an end rhyme or stuck on a feeling of like, now we're done with a section and it's not related to the section that we're coming to. I wanted the whole poem to feel like it was all one big, like a guy that you just won't stop talking at the bar is what I talk about it in the introduction. But I feel like that's really the spirit of the poem is a guy who's just standing there going, I have to tell you this story. I have to tell you. And you're going to have to listen, you know? Yeah.
So do you feel like you were sort of fighting the novelist in you versus the poet, or were those totally in tune? Because I mean, the clarity of the storytelling, you might think that would get, like if you put too many rhymes in there, isn't that going to get in the way of the story? I think you managed not to do that. You managed to both have the rhymes and the oomph poetically, but then you also have this energy in the storytelling. But I guess I wonder, in the process, was that hard to do both those things at once, or did they seem like they went together for you?
I am really lucky, and weirdly lucky, because I already wrote the Beowulf novel. Like I have the weird structure of how this happened is that I wrote an adaptation of Beowulf in my life, and that was where I was like, I diverged from the Beowulf story. I told it from other POVs. I did all kinds of fucked up things to it, which satisfied me. Yes. And then I decided that I was going to translate it. Somebody said, "Why haven't you done that?" And I was like, "I'm not going to do that. I already wrote a novel." And then I thought about it a little more and got tempted and decided to do the translation. And so I was able to follow very closely. I did it line by line. And I didn't feel an urge to like go novelist on it, really. Yeah. I had already gone there. So I was like, okay, let's see what this thing really says. Let's see. And also let's see what it says underneath what it says. Like I'm curious. I'm always curious. And I think that's novelist curiosity. I'm curious about subtext and implications that I think have not always been pressed on in lots of translations, because people just didn't think about them that way. And lots of male translators of this text who weren't, I think, thinking about the implications for the characters who weren't the warriors. Mm-hmm. In the case of the deaths that were happening and the death of sons that happens over and over, and women grieve them throughout the poem. And so I was just interested in really seeing what was in the poem, but also the language of it. The Mere is a really poetic novel, but really different. It doesn't rhyme. It's not so much alliteration. It's like free poetry. And in this case, this is just me being a nerd. And also, like, I was like, can I make it rhyme and have it not feel ridiculous? Yeah. And can I make it? And there were times that I had to stop with the joy and help of my beloved partner, who was like, you now sound like Edgar Allan Poe and you need to pull it back. And indeed, like, there were times when I was just like, control over my frenzy, because I wanted it to feel modern. And it's hard because poetry, rhyming poetry doesn't really feel modern unless you're using pretty peculiar rhythms to make it.
If you make it, I mean, you have a sort of hip hop vibe to it, right? I mean, there's lots of rhyme in our culture, but it feels totally modern.
It does, right? Absolutely. It's not categorized as classic poetry, but I was like, we have those tools. I wanted to be able to use all the tools we have, so I tried.
Well, I love the way you were able, and Emily, I think you do this in your translation of the Odyssey as well, is even staying within the structure and the language, finding those moments where you can crack open a character's story and just give them a little bit more room to breathe and just allow their story to actually land, as opposed to just rushing by it. And I feel like the women, I mean, that was just done so brilliantly in the case of all the women, including, and I'm going to say her name wrong, but Modred, did I get that? How am I?
I'm going to say it wrong too. I am not a scholar of Old English stuff. I find that I often am like, I hope I'm saying this word right. But yeah, she's a really interesting character.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting you mentioned in your introduction that she's often cut, but she's this character who is really angry and defensive, and she's constantly being stared at by guys, and she makes them face consequences for their behavior. So I loved how you just found little moments to, a character who's often cut and just letting them breathe in the lines that are there. And I think I have to talk about Grendel's mother, because I thought, obviously your novel is amazing about Grendel's mother, and this is amazing. And the thing, this is coming totally from my own ignorance, but I had no idea that there was so much debate about whether she was a woman or whether she was a monster. And in fact, she's most likely a woman. that totally blew my mind, and I felt like you made the pathos of her as a mother, as a woman, as a warrior who is, you know, alone, and why someone like that might get called monstrous but is not. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear all your thinking about how you tackled her in the context of the poem after dealing with her so beautifully in the novel.
Yes, and also, somebody's asking you about the tattoo. This is the moment to show your tattoo. And how do you render?
There's the top of it. Let's see, it goes all the way down. Yeah, so this is the Beowulf, Grendel's mother, dragon, Grendel word from Beowulf, which the horror of having to say this word as many times as I've had to say it, I should know how to say it. It's like aglacha, but it means probably formidable person, like a warrior. But it is usually, when it refers to Grendel's mother, it's translated as hag or monster hag or hell bride. There are many different variations on the way that this word has been translated. So this was the inspiration for Mirwife. This is why I wrote that book. She's a war veteran in my book. But I thought it was really, interesting and also not interesting. We're all so bored with being translated as hag and hell bride, but like. It's such a long tradition of failure when it comes to formidable women. And so I was just I've always been really interested in looking more closely at characters like that who've been mistranslated or neglected or shoved to the margin when that's not at all where they belong. And I think that Grendel's mother obviously didn't belong in the margin. She's one of 3 battles. She's the middle battle. Come on.
Yes, absolutely. And also that I love the way that in your introduction you talk about the ways that there's all this interpretation that's going on in the translation tradition as well as the scholarly tradition, which and you have that great analysis of these people presenting her as somebody with claws, but if you've ever had a manicure, you know you can't do these certain things with claws. I thought it was a great moment. But also just how other translators have got in the way of the text itself in certain ways. That it's not just about sort of let me impose my own feminist reading. It's that the text isn't necessarily saying she's a hag, and if you just don't assume all women are hags, you may come to it with a different set of preconceptions.
You might it's funny, like basically she's fierce, and so people were like, well, obviously she's ugly, like, and there's a long tradition of just really not thinking that through, I think, and thinking that it doesn't talk about how she looks at all. Like the original text says nothing about how she looks. It says that she has a knife. She's like really fierce. She's probably an older woman. She's been queen for 50 years in her own kingdom. She's like Hrothgar, which is so badass. Like she's an old woman fighting a guy, Beowulf, who's probably 18. Like, and she is so scary to him. He has to fight hard. He almost dies. He's frightened of death the whole time he's fighting her, and he's fully armored up. And I think how irresistible is that to look at closely. And in this translation, she is translated as kind of an outlaw, as a warrior woman outlaw, rather than as a hell bride or a hag or like an ugly, nasty troll thing, or like, like people really embroidered their own feelings about women on the character.
Your translation also brings out that it's both about women, but also about outsiders or homeless people or people who are outside our quote unquote civilized community. That we don't like poor people trying to get in, or we don't like people who don't have as much money as us. But there's actually a capitalist or consumerist reading, which is also a lot of projection that's going on in that.
The idea that they want our stuff is such a part of the poem. The feeling that whoever they are trying to come in and take all our gold and all our pretty rings and all of our, and that's really not the goal of Grendel. Grendel isn't looking to do that. Grendel's looking in, he's curious, and then he's like, they're really loud, so loud, and clearly he's really sensitive and upset by the loudness. And he does something very, very bad, like he chews for 12 years, but it's not a situation where he's coming in to like steal the shit. He's coming in because he can't stand the culture that's in that hall, which I think is legitimate. There's absolutely a reason to not be able to stand that culture. It's a claiming culture.
Right. So I guess we move to the female characters, but it seems to me that your translation also gives us so much new insight into the male characters, into what does it mean to be male in this culture and within the world of this poem. And maybe partly because you don't identify as male, it's easier for you to sort of get purchase on maleness is a marked category for you. It's a weird thing to be, and look at these people performing this weird thing, which is maleness. So I guess I'm curious if you can sort of talk about that and talk about, I mean, in the reading that you did of the death of Grendel, we have that really fascinating allusion to Cain and Abel, and that sense of what does it mean to be brothers? Are brothers in humans going to murder each other, or is there something about being a man, being bro, that you're going to both be always boasting but also always slaughtering? So you're talking about masculinity in this poem a bit, in this translation.
Always, like, there's such masculine competition. I mean, that's why the poem starts with bro in my translation, because I'm just really interested in the ways in which in this poem, people name each other as familial presences. They're like, you're my guy, you're mine. And Hrothgar says this about Beowulf. When Beowulf kills Grendel, Hrothgar is like, you're my son now. I love you, you're my family. And enough that his own wife is like, we have 2 sons. What's going on? What are you doing? Did you just adopt a warrior, like, without asking? Okay. And the culture of, like, masculine power in this poem, and the ways in which you try to accumulate worshippers of your badassery, as Beowulf does, but also try to accumulate good so that you are safe, so that you can, like, have safety surrounding you. It feels really, I mean, I'm not going to say it feels modern to me. It feels like we have never changed. Like, we're still doing the same thing in the culture. We're doing the same kind of rituals that are like, am I a man? Am I a good man? Mm-hmm. Maybe not. What do I have to do? I have to kill a monster maybe to be a good man. And we do a lot of monster creation culturally all over the world. Like, there's a lot of, like, frantic monster designation that happens when we're trying to prove that we're the man, prove that we're masculine and, powerful enough. Masculine and powerful are synonyms for each other in patriarchal culture that we're in. So it's, it was interesting to read things like the Hrothgar speech, the old man speech that he gives, that's like, listen to me, listen to the things I've learned. You can go bad if you're not careful. You're basically, your ego can take charge and you end up doing all the wrong things. You get a lot of power, you think you're good to go, and now you are a criminal. Mm-hmm. Watch your soul. Like, you're such a badass. Watch your soul, though. And it's a tender speech. Like, it's a different kind of, like, elder masculinity trying to comment. And then later Beowulf gives a similar speech himself to Wiglaf towards the end, as he's about to go sacrifice himself solo to a dragon that he knows better than to fight with, but he just cannot control his urge to prove his masculinity by fighting another monster.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we haven't talked about sort of the nuts and bolts of your relationship with Old English. I mean, so how did you get to that, and just to the whole to this text? I mean, obviously you've been reading it for years and years and years in different ways. I mean, how much did you see yourself as giving sort of a new interpretation of this old text versus this is what it really is and should be seen as?
I mean, it was a dirty slog. I have never studied Old English. It's formally studied. Obviously, I've been, like, digging for years and years at this point. I've been, like, in Beowulf for, like, 7 years. Somehow, accidentally, I took a left turn and Beowulf was in front of me, and I just couldn't leave it alone. But my own relationship with the original is a relationship of deep curiosity. I'm so interested in, and this shows, I think, in the translation, I'm interested in the way the English language has evolved from Old English and the way that it has grabbed from everything else and, like, become a language made of slang. Yeah. Which is why I use the slang in this translation as much as I do the present day slang, but also old slang. But I, just reading the original and with a dictionary and then another dictionary and then, like, 9 volumes of scholarly works, I was basically just the worst companion for the past 2 years, because I had to travel with a pile of dirty books, and they were like dirty as in not pornographic, but like Old English was my porn for the past couple of years. So I've been just like staring and going, what does this word mean? Could it mean this? Yes, it could mean this, and it could also mean 19 other things, which is one of the like kind of glorious perils and fun things about Old English, is that many of the words have like such a long list of meanings and potential that you can look at it and play with. So yeah, so I was just roaming in the depths, basically.
And as I was reading through and sort of rereading it, I found myself underlining something, every other sentence of loving your juxtaposition, loving the way you're bringing old things in and new things in, and just the perfect mixture of those, and what a buoyant and exciting mixture you found. One of the characters that I felt like, again, that you really brought to life was sort of some of that. You said in the introduction that you found the text funny, that one of the components is that there is humor to the text. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I guess I'll see. But I feel like you absolutely found that. And you brought out, one of the characters is Unferth, who, is very, very anti-Beowulf, and then, unexpectedly stands Beowulf at this really key moment. And your description of that was just, it made me laugh out loud. And I felt like you captured this incredible, fun reversal in the text with just such life and excitement.
I have to say, like, I didn't think Beowulf was funny either. I when I read it for the first time in high school, like many people did, I was like, I want it to be amazing. I want dragons. I want bitey dragons. And it was I think Chickering translation. It was a translation that is not known for its juicy, fun aspects. Like maybe most are not known for that. That's an unusual quality of the Beowulf translation, but that was feeling this like bitter disappointment, because I wanted the thrill of the wild, fantastical narrative, and I wanted the female warrior to seem amazing, and instead she was just like kind of shuffled off over here. But I've read the Tolkien translation a few years ago while I was working on Meerwife, and the Tolkien translation is not known for its like glorious readability. It wasn't meant to be published. It was his teaching notes that he did a translation, and then he was also teaching from it, so he worked on it forever. It has amazing notes, but it reads like pastiche Lord of the Rings. It's very weird, and you feel like you're not reading Beowulf. You feel like you're definitely reading Tolkien, and Tolkien's like Lord of the Rings kind of noble voice. And to me, it's not a very successful or satisfying thing to read. However, the feeling of masculine ridiculosity really shows in this particular translation. Like you feel the men going, I'm gonna stand on a table and brag, I'm gonna be the top guy. And that's what that Unferth and Beowulf thing is, when Beowulf is talking about Brecca and he's like, I am a slaughterer of sea monsters, I made them into sashimi, I'm such a badass, and it just reads as if you're thinking about Beowulf as somebody who's like 18 years old and bragging to a king and trying to sell himself. And later in the poem, you learn that Beowulf is not beloved where he comes from. Right. He's like kind of, everybody's like, oh, like, come on, man, I just stop it. And so when he gets to Hrothgar, he wants to show how badass he is and how fierce he is. And so he brags and brags and brags. And you can see why he would drive everyone crazy, but it doesn't show in all of the translations, because I think it's just not, like, you haven't been the person listening to it, maybe. Like, I feel like in my life as a woman, I've often been like sitting at the bar table listening to someone do that thing and going, what are you doing? Like, what are you trying to prove? What, you just trying to talk about that one gig you had as a salesman and you were so badass? Like, it just calm down, like sit down. But like, it's hard to sit down once you're already going, and that Beowulf never sits down. The whole poem, he's just not sitting down and proving himself. Even when he's like, 70 years old, he's still going, I'm the biggest, I'm the strongest. It's an interesting quality in the poem. It's pretty funny. Like, but then it's kind of sad as he gets as he's an old man and doing the same thing that he did when he was a teenager, then you can get the payoff at the end that he's like still unsatisfied. And he's done all of this stuff and he's still like, and no one is satisfied. Like every time there's a big battle and everyone dies, there's always repeatedly, there's a single griever going, oh, I have to bury everybody. Everyone has to, and this is, and the person apologizes for the misery and then the world moves on, but it's like grief, bragging, grief.
Mm-hmm.
Which, is, we are there right now as a country. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about in the way that we transact our, whether it's like big dick Americana or whatever it is, whatever way we're talking about ourselves as a nation or as a culture, it's like we often do the same sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. I mean, I guess I'm really impressed by just how you managed to be both funny and deeply serious. I mean, you're actually making this very, very serious intervention, both about our culture and about how we read Beowulf. And you managed to do it so it feels so fun, and it's so full of these fun level of inventiveness. But you're making us go through this very deep human process of figuring out the monstrosity of humans and the humaneness of monsters and toxic masculinity and bragging and just all these moments about awareness of grief and of people tussling over land that doesn't belong to any of them. And I mean, I felt like also I understood the ecological elements of Beowulf much better from your version than I have from any other version. The way that these creatures are coming from this land which isn't being properly noticed by all these guys who are saying it's theirs. I guess I just want to stand for that. I mean, stand for the way you manage to both be laughing, but you're not laughing because you don't take things seriously. You're laughing because it's so serious.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know you both work in material that has similar elements. There are similar things where a guy is trying to tell his story and he's making himself feel better about the chaos that is in his path and that's all around him. He's trying to say, I had to do it like this because I'm the guy. What am I supposed to do? Right. And the Odyssey is full of that, and classical mythology is just always full of things of that kind, and as is this. I mean, any culture that has heroics also has, I think, the hero looking around him going, maybe I went too far, but I'll just try to tell the story. And so in this case, it's not Beowulf telling the story, right? And usually it's not. It's the chorus telling the story, or it's like there's someone else telling the story. And I'm always interested in the way that someone else can tell the story of someone who is flawed and more complicated, in your word. Like,
yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think Madeline makes things complicated about the Odyssey in a different way. I mean, I think we're all interested in complex narratives and complex kinds of heroes. And yeah, I mean, I guess the way that Odysseus is sort of like a character who could fit right into Beowulf, right? I mean, he's both very, very boastful, full of all these spinning stories, spinning lies. He's always done more than anyone else, and he's always going to go on about it more. And the verbal inventiveness is there for Odysseus as well as for the characters in Beowulf as well. Mm-hmm. I think there are also differences, right? I mean, the ways that monstrosity is depicted in the Odyssey, I think, is somewhat different. But I mean, I guess I would be curious to hear from Madeline also about whether you see parallels or lacks of parallel between Beowulf and the world of Greek mythology, the world of the Odyssey.
I mean, I definitely see some parallels. The thing that I underlined about 1,000,000 times was it's better to fight than cry, which I think Achilles would definitely understand, although he cries a lot too.
I think we both at the same time, yes.
Yeah. But the sort of idea that, you have to get the vengeance first and you have to push back first. And what an articulation of sort of this very particular hidebound heroic masculinity. So I was looking at things like that. I was also looking at the tension between sort of how these characters want to be extraordinary. They want to be the best and they want to make their boast, but at the same time, they have to be deeply connected to the people around them, that you actually can't survive by yourself in these incredibly uncertain worlds. And so you need to have the connections at the same time that you're putting yourself above them, but also you also have to be careful about how you're doing that. And, as Hrothgar says, you have to keep reaching out. You have to keep giving gifts. You can't put yourself too far above, even as you are extraordinary. And so I was really interested in the tension between sort of best of the Achaeans, the idea of the one best, and also the fact that you need other people and you have to be aware of that need all the time. So that was something that I felt like I was seeing. And of course, the digressive aspects are there, and this is something, Emily and Marie, that you guys both did so wonderfully, which is that I think oftentimes people coming to these texts for the first time in English can get overwhelmed by those digressive elements because they're so different from modern novels in that sense. It's this hallmark of the epic style, and balancing keeping that there with keeping the narrative moving is something that you guys both did so beautifully. So those were some of the things I felt like I saw where the similarities were really there, and the obsession with people eating people. The cannibalism aspect was just like, oh my gosh, there's so much. It's like male body horror about like, I'm going to be eaten. It was really interesting.
Yeah, body's disintegrating too. I mean, the fact that Grendel loses an arm and body parts could get separated from the place they're supposed to be. I could disintegrate, or I could be swallowed. And that, which I think it sort of taps into what you're saying about the fragility of masculinity. You want this sort of ultimate wholeness, and I'm bigger and more whole than anyone else and more integral. But then I also have to be attached to other people, and I might get swallowed or ripped apart in some way.
It's so interesting, I think, in Beowulf that he's single. He just doesn't get married. He doesn't.
Yes.
He just travels solo for the whole thing, and he has longing, I think, and it's. I feel like it's really in there. Like his feeling of entwinement with his king is there. He's like, my guy. That's my guy. I'm loyal to him, and he grieves for him and longs for him when he dies. But he does not. He doesn't have like a companion there beside him, and he also doesn't even to do his like extra work, which is what Hrothgar is doing with Wealhtheow. It's like she's doing a lot of his like calming work, the work of calming his people. So she's like his good hand going out into the crowd. But like, the idea of what happens, like, when I read Beowulf for the first time, even I thought this guy is not really human. Like he doesn't do the things that other humans do in the story. He just is this wandering solo guy who like wants to be the best at everything, but doesn't hold hands with anybody. And yet he's a good king. He's a good king. He's a good king. But we can see that he has huge problems throughout, and that he's like in a different category. Really, he's just not like the other humans, which is. If he's a human at all, he really doesn't feel so human the way that he is. But I love at the end when he briefly has his companion Wiglaf, who's fighting with him, like his lone brave buddy, little guy. And he really can't even quite let that happen. He does the like last stab of the dragon, but he wants it really just to be his own. And it's so lonely. It's I'm laughing, but it's a sad death. He has to just go to the dead.
Right.
And that's the only one who joins throughout the whole thing.
Yes. I mean, maybe related to the lack of children is this way that he seems to be always trying to attack wounds, right? Or attacking mother figures, or there's this whole conflict between Beowulf as the lone male fighter who's then always attacking people who have family or who are family or could produce family. I'm realizing that we're at 8:15 already, and we were supposed to be paying attention to questions, right? Should we? Because there's a whole long list of super interesting looking questions that I'm just looking at on the questions and answers. There are no answers, which then the answers are our job. So we should be doing it, shouldn't we?
All right, here we go. I'm looking at one. This one has a lot of votes. So I think Emily, you and I are gonna take turns passing on reader questions. So this is Haley who's asking this. When I've taught medieval literature to college students, I've had trouble overcoming their assumption that these kinds of stories, Beowulf, etc., are really for men. How would you convince female or non-binary students that they can take ownership of these stories? Such a good question.
Here we are.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean they're marketed that way. They're marketed as these are men's true books, but like there are women and people who are ungendered throughout, people and all kinds of characters that are not male throughout all these stories, and I think my urge to take ownership of that is like, well, I also live in the world. Like I observe and see how the world works, and it's perfectly legitimate to come in and look at the stories of whatever the culture is that is like in the terms of like patriarchal ruling culture. Okay, but I can look at them from underneath and they can't see that, so I'm going to have a look. And I think that's a valid angle to take, like to go in and see because there are things that I think lots of people just kind of following the tradition of usual suspect translators or usual suspect scholars, maybe there are things they haven't seen. Like, I don't know if there's anything I saw in this text that people hadn't seen before. And I think I built on a lot of work by other people who had a lot of badass scholarly work around a lot of the things that I explore in this. But I wanted to put all of the thought together and think about it from a different angle than it had been thought about. And I think each one of us is capable of doing that. You know, gender doesn't matter. If the bullshit of being sold that it's not your story, makes me tired. So like everything is your story. If it's a story like this, it's a classical story, you can go in and have a look.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm a college professor too, like the questioner, and I think sometimes students, by the time they get to college, they've absorbed a lot of stuff either from high school or from the culture around them that maybe stuff that needs to get untaught. I mean, I'm thinking about you, Maria, how you connected with the figure of Grendel's mother from a picture book when you were 8, and then later, sort of, it seemed as if you were sort of being taught this is not actually your story if you're a woman warrior lover. Instead, it's something else. But maybe it actually is your story. Maybe you were right when you were 8 as well. And that there sometimes needs to be some sort of being willing either to unteach or to look critically at all this other stuff that's saying we have to read Homer in terms of the hero's journey. It has to be all about, yay, guys killing each other. We love guys. And it might be a little bit more complicated than that. And it's possible to invite people of any age, people of any genders, to be able to identify through saying, it's not what they're telling you. We can think differently from that. We can tell different stories. And we can see that they were already telling different stories at any age in history. Stories are there. Yeah. Okay, so we should get to Madeline. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I just completely agree with what both of you said. I think that there are so many different ways to look at these stories, and we need the new, fresh perspectives, because I feel like, just Emily, you brought this up about Maria's translation earlier, but this idea that people often translate Grendel's mother as having claws when the word is finger, but then she's wielding a knife. Anyone who's had long fingernails knows you can't wield a knife with long fingernails, and that's an example of sort of how that kind of stuff gets lost. And so we need these new voices. I just think it's so important. And for me, the key moment of connection was when I was reading the Odyssey and thinking about Circe's section and realizing that Odysseus himself is narrating this story. And I don't have to believe Odysseus because he lies his way across the Mediterranean. And so I can come to this, I can imagine my way into this story, and I can see it with my own eyes instead of through the heroic tradition, Odysseus's perspective, whoever this heroic narrator is, that I can see past them.
Absolutely. So next one, let me ask the next one. So from Lily Meyer asks, all three of you are examining the lost elements in your source texts, bringing out subtext, paring away the lacquer of what's been painted on. Who in the stories you've tackled is your favorite to look at more? Oh, wait a minute. I skipped one. I didn't mean to. Can we go back to the previous one after? Let's focus on Lily's first because I just messed up. Who is your favorite to look more closely at and why? A hero, a villain, a side character who makes a brief appearance? What draws you to this side character? How have you tried to bring out the light? Lost elements or lost characters? I mean, I guess it seems to me that from our conversation, we both have, it seems like we all three have a sense both of, we can show the main characters differently, right? It might be that there are ways there are lost elements even in the protagonists. Maybe you can get a clearer image of Odysseus or Beowulf or Achilles from the one that's out there. But I guess for me, in terms of translating the Odyssey, I felt in the course of that project, I got a much clearer sense, and I tried to help the reader to get a clear sense of the enslaved characters, who I think if you're retelling the story of the Odyssey, people tend not to talk about the fact that this is about an enslaving society, and the enslaved characters are really interesting and rounded characters, and that the poem is sort of grappling with the deep injustice of a society that enslaves human beings. And of course, it's not a poem that comes from the perspective of fully acknowledging the moral horror of slavery, but those characters, Melanthius, Melantho, Eurycleia, Eumaeus, those to me sort of shine out as absolutely essential elements in the poem.
I have a similar answer, actually. In Beowulf at the very end, and this is a person that people talk about often, there's a woman at Beowulf's funeral who screams. Like she sings what is described basically as a song of like, all the horrors are coming for me now. But and that's the only time she appears. People sometimes like speculate that maybe she's Beowulf's wife who has never been mentioned anywhere else. Okay, maybe. But even if she is, like to have somebody scream at the funeral, basically it's always been awful and it's still awful and it's never getting better, is such a perspective on the poem that we just came all the way through. We came all through this hero and all of this bravery and courage and goodness. And then we have someone screaming at the end, not it was so good, but it's going to be so bad, and really an implication that it's always been pretty bad for her. Yeah. Like it really gives you another angle on the whole poem before, and it's there for a reason. So I love to look at stuff like that.
I mean, I guess just to pick up again on, I think the fact that if you look through the slave's perspective, which I think the poem partly allows you to do, the whole story of homecoming feels totally different because these people never have a home of their own. They're never going to go back to their birth family. They've been taken and they're never going to get to go home. Just the whole image of what is this as a story about homecoming, it's different if you think, what is it for the enslaved people?
Yeah. Yes. All right, I'm gonna ask this next one here. I'm gonna skip a little bit my answer to that because I feel like I wrote a whole novel on the side character that I wanted to write about, and then on another whole novel on the other side character that I wanted to write about. But in general, I feel like I'm always interested in the stories of the characters who don't get to tell. Who don't get to tell their story, and what characters are silenced and what pieces of their story are told and what are not. And for me, one of the main ways into Circe's story was just, why is she turning men into pigs? Which is never addressed in any way, and is treated in later literature as if like, well, that's just what women do. If they're alone and have power, they'll just turn you right into a pig. And I thought that was really insulting and boring. And so digging into sort of why these characters might act the way they act, and looking at these characters who don't get to tell their stories. So here's a question here. I would love to hear from Scott. I would love to hear about any particular instances where the maleness of previous translators, their phallocentrism, had a clear impact on phrasing or meaning, and how you may have altered or fixed that.
I mean, I've just been talking about a lot of it because it's about Grendel's mother and her looks and her claws, which, I think that was just assumption. I think it was an assumption of like, she's a single mother, and also her evil. Like, I think a lot of evil got grafted onto her because she was a single mother, and we don't know who Grendel's father is. And there's also an assumption which if you're thinking about the Victorian era, this makes some sense. Like you're thinking there's no father, nobody, it doesn't occur to anyone that Grendel's father might have been a monster. And it seems to not have occurred to any of those translators that potentially is a possibility. So they're like, well, it has to be her. So she's bad. She's like, there's all of this sort of history of bad women, biblical history. And we have like plenty of history of giants and difficulties with women who don't conform, and then there are problems. So like she gets a bunch of other Christian stuff grafted onto her that isn't necessarily in the poem itself. And also, just badness attached to her character that isn't really in the poem. In the poem, it's about, I think, a lot of what she does is honor. She does an honor killing, basically. She killed the one guy from the camp that killed her kid. She doesn't kill the killer, but she kills one of the guys, an important guy. And that's pretty much feud rule law. That's like allowed. What she does is allowed. So I think the difficulty with a character like that for male translators, particularly the Victorian era and early 20th century male translators, but we had the same difficulty going forward all the way into like Grendel by John Gardner, where Grendel's mother is mute and she's kind of covered with fur. She's loyal, but she's an animal. And I think that just comes from really not thinking at all about how this might have happened. How, their son is from some relationship, that child was born not just to her. And she's alone for some reason. We don't know why. So but being alone doesn't make you bad. We still think that makes you a monster in our society. We've thought that for a long time. Being alone and capable makes you a monster throughout history as a woman. And I think a lot of the older male translators just really assumed that was true. And, we don't have any shortage of guys thinking that's true now, and of all kinds thinking that's true now. So it's a longstanding weird idea that we have about powerful women.
The example that I usually bring up about the Odyssey, that in fact I was shocked to realize after publishing my translation just how differently other people had done it, is the hanging of the enslaved women by Telemachus. Where so many male English translators add in abusive language so that the narrator seems to be saying these women were sluts, and they put in words like sluts because they've been raped by the suitors, they're tainted, and of course they're criminals, and of course they have to die. And the narrator has to suggest, of course we all are rooting for women who are sluts to be murdered. And I don't think the original is actually rooting for that. I think the original is suggesting there's this really complex shifting of point of view where you can see why a vulnerable sort of man-child, ashamed boy like Telemachus is going to want to take it out on women because he doesn't feel like a man unless he does that. Yeah. But that's not the same as the narrator saying there's something wrong with these people who are suffering and are going to have a terrible, pitiable death. In the original, there isn't abusive language at the women. They represent, real human beings who are suffering and scared and trapped and don't get a homecoming. And the poem thinks homecomings actually matter, and people want that. It's kind of shocking to me that the fluidity of perspective, which I think is there in the original, being able to acknowledge their people and they have their point of view on the story, then sort of gets erased if you're not going to be able to think women could be people, or enslaved people could be people. I guess I'm also thinking, I'm doing the Iliad right now, and it's been striking to me to realize how many, translators are sort of objectifying Helen by saying she's super beautiful, and that's where all this trouble starts, with her looking too good. Yeah. But the original really doesn't say very much about how she looks. It's not actually about how she looks. And so that also is interesting to me, how there are particular assumptions that people have about how do wars come about, or how does murder happen. It's probably because women look too good. I don't think that's a very good explanation.
Yes. And I think all of that goes for Cersei, that she has been treated, she's been villainized over and over and over again. And now I think she's been reclaimed by many writers and sort of, given a more even-handed portrait. And her portrait in Homer is actually a little bit more even-handed, that she is one of the most helpful characters that Odysseus encounters, if you kind of look at her encounter with Odysseus objectively. but after that, she was really remembered as like, a villainous, seductive, lying woman who was, going to make men into beasts. And so just wanting to push back against that very sort of flat, sexist version of her character. But I feel like that phallocentrism actually also extends into like heteronormativity in sort of modern culture. And one of the things that frustrated me so much about Achilles and Patroclus, and what sort of brought me into their story originally, was how often in the modern world I was hearing their story presented as like not even, I feel like there's sort of two paths you can go with Achilles and Patroclus. You can go love story, which was well established in the ancient world, or you could go like deep male friendship, also well established in the ancient world. But it's like America was too afraid of both of those. They had to go like bro or like cousin or like something else that like we couldn't handle male intimacy.
Yeah.
And I thought, like, what is going on? Why can't we have, male intimacy here, whether it's friendship, whether they're lovers? I obviously wanted to go the lover. It was, that or bust. I never considered any other path. Because I also felt like in particular, that path was being pushed aside, closeted, silenced, ignored. But, I feel like that it affects a lot of characters, all the female characters, but also characters who are, LGBTQ, characters who are non-binary. And so I feel like it kind of oozes into everything.
Yeah, it's fascinating how there are all these poems about like intense and passionate male emotion, which is what all of these things are. But real difficulty with intimate relationships between men. There's the same thing happens in Beowulf. It's like Beowulf and Hygelac are really close, and I think, ample, in my opinion, suggestion that they're lovers, but that's, not explicitly, but I think the possibility is definitely there, and it's interesting. It makes the story more interesting if we're talking about passion and love and like what you were willing to die for, which is what these stories are always about. Why would you like redact this possibility of love and this possibility of friendship and this possibility of depth of feeling from in translation and in adaptation when you could have all of that in the story, and it would be so much more meaningful if it was left where it belongs in the story,
Are we allowed to do more, or are we supposed to wrap up? Because I realize we've already had an hour. We're supposed to wrap up, right?
Would you like to do one more question?
Do one more? Yeah, we can definitely do one more. What's the next one up? It's my turn, right? I think it's my turn. Yes. So, were there any female translators in antiquity? If the answer is no, that's the woman who you most admire for her translation work. Other female translators out there, who do we admire?
Lots of people.
Lots of people, yes.
Yeah.
Lots of people.
Yeah. I admire blank, and it's so embarrassing. She is a translator of Danish poetry. There's an amazing book by Inger Christensen called Alphabet that was translated by Susanna. Can't remember Susanna's last name, but it's a Fibonacci sequence. The poem is written in it's an alphabetical poem written in a Fibonacci sequence. It's crazy, and I do not know how she translated it from Danish and kept it into English and kept it working. But it's one of the most moving, like, end of the world poems about appreciating every tiny piece of the world as the world is falling. It's like, I read it once a year. It's extraordinary. And the translation, I haven't read it in the original, but the translation is an astonishing piece of work. It's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always find it hard to pick the answer for these, like, what's your favorite kind of questions? I'm horrible at that kind of question. I guess I want to say it's so great. I think it's hard to find female translators from Greek or Roman antiquity. Who knows? Maybe there were Roman translators from Greek, but we don't have them. We have only one poet who's female from ancient Rome, and then little bits and testimonies. That's about it. I mean, but there are lots from the early modern period and then going into the Enlightenment. So maybe I want to do a shout out to Lucy Hutchinson, who translated Lucretius, which is a fantastic poem about Epicureanism and why you should convert to Epicureanism and believe in atoms and be tranquil. And it's just really, really beautifully written. And she's a really interesting figure. And in a way, you could say this is the first epic translation by a woman into English. So I feel like we should just bow to her as our muse for tonight.
Yeah, and I'll throw in. She was really influential early on. The book Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. Yeah. Her translation of Sappho is also beautiful. But Autobiography of Red, I read it and I thought, oh my gosh, you can do that. You can write that like that. So if you have not read Autobiography of Red, I highly recommend everyone.
One of the best books. And that's one of those books where it's all over the map in terms of what it's doing, and it's so successful, like so good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I just want to say, Maria, this has been such a privilege to get to be here and celebrate this incredible new translation. If this has not convinced you, I don't know what to say, because this is brilliant and you should all get it immediately. And if you haven't had Emily's, ditto.
I mean, this is a reading list. If you want this reading list, I think it would be a satisfying semester of hanging out with some old and some new at the same time. Like, thank you. What an honor to be with you guys tonight. I feel
really
so.
Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you. Thanks all three of you. And there's so many great book recommendations that you all made through this. And I want to give a shout out to our event production intern, Simone, who's been putting them all in links in the chat. And we'll put a list of everything that you talked about on our website. So that you all can just read forever based on tonight's event. Thank you, all three of you. What a great conversation. And thanks to our audience for joining us. And
I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. I just wanted to say sorry about that, because the questions were great.
Does this still live in a place after we come down? Does the chat live and the questions? Oh, good.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And the video will be on the Center for Fiction's website. And so we'll... You can
also thank you to the Center for Fiction for coming up with this idea and getting us all here.
It was the dream team tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's really fun to talk to you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.